Hi everyone and welcome to this video. Today we're going to be looking at AQA's paper 2 and revising the June 2024 paper with the topic of hospitals and I suppose medicine. It was a paper which focused on medical school and hospitals and doctors and nurses and that kind of thing. So that was the theme for that year. So for this video, I'm going to be progressing through the 5 questions that make up paper 2. Here is hopefully a relatively clear map of the paper, starting from the reading section, questions 1 to 4, through to the writing task for question 5. I've also included the main thing that students will be doing for that question, the number of marks, the approximate number of minutes that students should be spending on that particular question, as well as some bullet points about what that question might be assessing. And as you can see, no surprise, as you progress through the paper, the marks slowly increase, which means that the amount of time that you spend has to increase as well. One of the bits of advice that I've always given my students is that they might want to consider starting with the writing task, question 5, and then working their way backwards. For some students, they find that getting the big question out of the way first means that they don't have to worry about running out of time, for example. And it also means you get that big 40-mark question out of the way first. And at the beginning of the exam, the adrenaline is pumping more. You might find it slightly less painful to do it first. You don't necessarily have to read anything for question 5, except obviously the task. So that's for you to decide. But in this video, we're going to be talking about each of these questions and going through them one by one. So the beginning for this video is a very good place to start. We're going to be looking at question 1. And for question 1, it's usually the case that students will have to refer to the first part of one of the extracts. And in this case, it was lines 1 to 13 of source A. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through this and then show you the question. In fact, I'm going to show you the question first because it's helpful to read the questions first and then read the extract as you go. So the question was read lines 1 to 13, and as is always the case, to choose 4 true statements from a selection of 8 of them, which are labelled A to H, as you can see below. So 4 of these statements are going to be true, 4 of them are going to be false, and you need to pick the 4 of them which are true. So let's go back and read this opening section, and then I'll give you some time to select your 4 answers. So the author, who I believe was called Adam Kay, he says, because medical schools are oversubscribed tenfold, all candidates must be interviewed, with only those who perform best under a grilling being awarded a place. It's assumed all applicants are on course for straight A grades at A-level, so universities base their decisions on non-academic criteria. Imperial College London were satisfied that my distinctions in grade 8 piano and saxophone, alongside some half-hearted theatre reviews for the school magazine, qualified me perfectly for life on the hospital wards. And so in 1998, I packed my bags and embarked upon the treacherous 6-mile journey from Dulwich to South Kensington. As you might imagine, learning every single aspect of the human body's anatomy and physiology, plus each possible way it can malfunction, is a fairly gargantuan undertaking. But the buzz of knowing I was going to become a doctor one day, such a big deal you get to literally change your name, like a superhero or an international criminal, propelled me towards my goal through those 6 long years. So, that is the bit you're reading. I'm going to give you some time now. I'm going to pause the video and you can select the 4 true statements here, and then I'll go through the answers. So the answers for this task were A, C, F, and H. I could explain why B, D, E, and G are false, but to make this video as concise as possible, I'm not going to. But this is a question where you really have to double check the extract to make sure that you are being factually correct. This seems like a simple task, but as you may know, the examiner can reword the statements to trip some students up. Sometimes you've got to use your inference skills and read between the lines. So you have to be careful with this. This is only 4 marks, so potentially 4 minutes. Some of you might do it quicker than that, which is great because then that's time you can spend on a different question. So A, C, F, and H are the true ones here. Question 2. And the marks by this point will begin to steadily increase. Question 2 is going to be one of the 2 comparison questions. So the instruction, which of course is very important, is you've got to read the entire source A and the entire source B, because that's how you're going to be able to maximize your chances of being able to find a comparison or a point to make about both extracts. So the task here was requiring students to compare the places and the settings where each respective writer was working. And it's from those differences between the places that you then write your comparison as a summary. So this is the question where students have to refer to evidence in both extracts. Concise evidence works best. You've also, though, importantly, got to show the examiner that you can interpret information in your own words. So what does this mean to you? And that's why when I've always taught this question, I've always got students to use the words suggesting or suggests, because it's that word that can help prompt students to give some kind of personal response. So the more detailed the inferences, the more marks you will get. So I'm not going to read the extracts. I will hopefully be able to put the extracts below in the description box. But assuming that you've read the extracts for this, let's look at what you can say for source A. So source A, the writer mentions all of these things. You don't have to refer to all of these in the exam to get marks, but certainly when I was reading these extracts and I'm being asked to talk about where Adam K is working, these were things that jumped out at me. And then as you can see in blue, I've put the word suggesting, and then in my own words underneath, I've written down what this suggests to me about the hospital where the writer is working. So what this suggests to me is that this is quite a high-tech hospital, meaning that this is potentially quite a wealthy, developed nation, because the hospital has been able to be kitted out with quite complex machinery, which is obviously going to be quite expensive. In recent years, in the last 20 years or so, particularly in richer nations, hospitals and the medical profession have really been able to utilize technology a lot more, and I imagine will continue to as technology develops in the coming decades. So the complex machinery and technology means that there is a variety of medical treatment available, and that might mean increased chances of survival and effective healthcare provision. However, that's only half the story, because this is a comparison question. So we've got to also compare what this means to source B. And source B is the opposite. The writer in source B tells us that she's effectively working in a small harbour where there are horse-drawn ambulances. She also describes where she's working as a wharf, um, which is really another kind of name for a harbour, really, in this sense, and with patients being stretched on wooden pallets. And very similar, I've got that word suggesting again. And in blue, I've written down what this means to me in my own words. So this suggests to me that this is not a lavish or high-tech place. The equipment is limited. It's quite old-fashioned, maybe. It's a different era. Well, source B is going to be the 19th century extract, so that's true. And it feels quite makeshift. It feels, well, it's outdoors. So it feels like this is not a proper hospital, but a place that has been set up quite spontaneously in order to offer some kind of medical treatment. This is wartime, or it was a wartime, so quite chaotic, um, medical treatment being quite stripped back, not luxurious, but just kind of what you need to do in order to make sure that soldiers or army personnel manage to, live another day. So we have here two very different places, which each writer is telling us about. So to give you an example, and I'm not going to read through this because it's displayed on the screen, but if you've watched any of my previous videos, you know that I'm a big fan of color coding and showing you how it all fits together. So very simply here, you can see very concise, precise, short bits of evidence in green, followed by lengthier details about what this evidence means to me. So the yellow here is the inference. And this could be your whole response. This could be what you write as your response. You've got about 10 minutes for this task. So you have to be realistic about how much you can get done in the time. This doesn't look like a lot, but if you were to copy this out by hand, it would be pretty similar to the lengths of answers that you will find in AQA exams. So this is enough here. So in summary then for question 2, make sure you're comparing, make sure you're quoting evidence, not a lot of evidence in terms of not long quotes, but quite concise quotes because that saves you time, but also making sure you're always asking yourself for the inference, what does this mean to me? And the more detailed you can go into with the inference, the more marks you should be receiving. Okay, so that's question 2. Moving on to question 3. Question 3, paper 2, will always ask you about language analysis. And in theory, it's exactly the same type of language analysis that you did for paper 1, question 2. The only difference here is that this is worth 12 marks, not 8. So you're spending about 15 minutes on this, approximately, to do it justice. Question 3 might ask you about either source, A or B. It will depend on the extract themselves and what the examiner deems to be the better extract for this task. But to speed things up here, what I have done is I have already given you the section of the extract which was the focus of this paper, and I've also begun to highlight what techniques exist within the parameters of those line numbers. So for this task, it was lines 30 to 39. And the question was, how does the writer use language to describe working night shifts at the hospital? So as is commonly the case, it's about how does the writer describe something to you? And in this case, it's the writer describing their night shifts. The 4 highlighted sections in yellow, green, blue and pink are not necessarily the only things you could highlight, but they're certainly things that jumped out to me and things that I would perhaps want to talk about if I was sitting this exam. So you could pause the video now and ask yourself, why have I highlighted these phrases or these quotes? What techniques exist here. And to start thinking about connotations, to start thinking about what is the writer telling us about his experience of working night shifts in a hospital as a newly qualified doctor. So you can pause the video now, or you can carry on watching. So in order to kind of speed things up a little bit, I've gone straight to bringing kind of all of these different strands of information together. So I've got the quotes down the left, I've got the techniques in the middle, and I've got the explanation of the effects in the right-hand column. So he's using this phrase unrelenting nightmare to show that this kind of never-ending, constant, continuous kind of unpleasant, scary experience. Um, a nightmare is a dream. This is not a dream, though. This is real life. This is what he signed up for. So it's that sense of lack of control, that sense of intimidation that he feels from being the only doctor on call during the night. You have that metaphor, and you could call it an extended metaphor because it continues over multiple kind of sentences, to do with sailing. And of course, if you're on your own sailing a ship, that can be quite scary too, if it's a large ship. Um, if you imagine yourself being alone on any kind of boat in the middle of the ocean, it's a very scary place to be, and one which is very hard for humans to, in fact, survive if you don't have your wits about you. So the ship itself is a large form of transport. To be alone on that would be very scary. That's how he feels in the hospital. So he has this overwhelming sense of responsibility. There's no support from colleagues because nobody else is on shift. And there might be this imminent sense of disaster with the fire, which creates that sense of chaos. So that's how he feels, being the only doctor on call in this very large hospital. The final thing is the repetition and the listing here, that you see ward after ward, nurse after nurse. And again, it goes back to that first example of the unrelenting nightmare, of something that is kind of monotonous and never seems to end. He's probably quite desperate to go home because he's intimidated with this task, and he's having to deal with multiple issues at once. So that can be obviously quite stressful. So for language analysis, the techniques in the middle column is not actually the most important part of your response. It's actually your explanation of the effects. It's why has the writer used these words? What do you think, feel, or imagine by the writer using these words or these phrases? So in terms of an example paragraph, here is one. Extended metaphor, the terminology I've put here in purple, and I've put 3 very short quotes in green to show you that being concise with quotes is often better. And around the outside of that, in things that I haven't highlighted, is really the analysis. That's what you're being marked on. So I've really tried to expand and explain to the examiner why I think those words or that technique has been used. So the more you can do that, the more marks you will get. This is one paragraph talking about one of those techniques. You might, after this, write 2 more to give you 3 in total, to show a range of different words. You've commented on a range of different words and phrases here. So that's an example paragraph that would be effective. And then we get to question 4. And question 4, in my experience of teaching this course now for a good 10 years, is that this is the question from paper 2 that students are most apprehensive about. So before I get to the question itself, I just want to remind you of what you're being asked to do for this task. So paper 2 is called Writers' Viewpoints and Perspectives, and that word perspective or viewpoint might make an appearance in the wording of question 4, because this question is the second of the comparison questions where you will need to refer to both extracts, and you'll be comparing what the writers think and feel about the issues and the topics which they are writing about. So it's really important to try and figure out what their opinions are, their attitudes, their thoughts about the issue, the topic that is the reason why they wrote the extract in the first place. You still need to refer to language techniques and methods as they're known, and also to be able to label what the viewpoints could be, so judgmental, sarcastic, humorous, and so on. So it's always worth, I think, being explicit to the examiner about how you have interpreted or labelled their viewpoint. How are they coming across to you? Importantly, as well, the higher level students will be considering what's known as positionality. So, what is the writer's position to the issues which they are writing about? So, to give you an example, if you have a writer who happens to be a parent and they are writing about children, that's going to affect their viewpoint because they're coming at something from the position of being a parent. If you have an extract about school or college and the writer is a teacher, that's also going to affect their attitude about what they're writing about because it's an area of expertise. That's going to affect their positionality. And positionality can also include things like gender or sex or race or religion. If you have a black writer that's writing about things like slavery, for example, that what you read might be affected by their own past, their own positionality. So question 4, it's always worth thinking about why does the writer have the attitude that they do? Are they bringing something to the table, some experience maybe, who they are, their identity, which might impact their attitude? Chances are that the extracts will be both written from the first person perspective because it's very hard to write about your own opinion using the third person perspective. So look out for the eyes because that will mean that they're writing about themselves, and that gives you from the get-go one method already to consider, which is to do with perspective. They're writing about themselves a lot of the time. So the question for this paper from 2024 for the summer paper was this: compare how the writers convey their different feelings and perspectives on providing medical care. So we've got the two writers here, Adam K for source A and Mary C. Cole for source B. Again, I'm not going to read the extracts now in the interest of time. I'm hoping to put them in the description box below. But what could we talk about for Adam K? So for some, students are taught just to select some quotes at random and then try and ascribe some kind of attitudes to the quotes they've picked. And some students are taught to be very careful and pick quotes that make it pretty obvious, perhaps, what their attitudes are. So here I've got the quote, perversely exhilarating, and you trail behind like a hypnotized duckling. That's not to say those are the only quotes you could use for this question, but these are two bits of evidence that jumped out at me when I was looking at these extracts. In brackets here, I've included the technique. We've got an adverb, an adjective, and a simile. So to answer the question, what is his attitude? I could describe his attitude as being energetic, passionate, realistic though, but also quite humorous. His description of the duckling is quite tongue-in-cheek and designed, I suppose, to be quite humorous rather than serious. So I could tie those into my answer as well. The big question, though, is why does Adam Kay have this attitude or these attitudes? So, as a doctor, as somebody that's paid his own money and spent a lot of time in medical school to do what is quite a challenging job, he clearly values medicine and helping people. He wants to make a positive difference despite the stress that the job may bring. He enjoys the challenge of the job. Some people do. Some people enjoy the challenge that a job might bring to them. Every day is different, for example. That's the same for teaching too. I'm sure if any teachers are watching this, they will agree. They value the fact, there we go, that every day is different. He's always been realistic. He's always known that being a doctor is going to be difficult. And he's worked hard at medical school to get his qualifications. Obviously, training is ongoing. And he wants to put his learning and expertise to good use. So, in other words, I suppose, in a nutshell, he's saying, yes, it's hard, but it's worth it. So, that could be one paragraph in which you analyse the feelings and perspectives of Adam Kay. There might be other quotes as well that you could pinpoint. This needs to be compared with Mary Seacole's attitudes. And again, I've picked two quotes here. She describes rough-bearded men standing by and crying like the softest-hearted women, which is a simile. And she also uses an adverb exclusively when she's talking about how she devoted herself to patients. So what is her attitude? Her attitude could be described as compassionate or caring or calm and respectful of her patients, which mostly are probably men because of the war that was going on. And we ask ourselves the same question again. Why does she have these attitudes? Well, she's perhaps quite motherly. She looks after these men as if they were her own children. She's caring. She's got a sympathetic character. And she's wanting to give them all of her attention to make them better or to help them repair from what would probably be quite atrocious injuries. She's a woman who just seems to get on with it. She doesn't complain about the lack of resources. She doesn't complain that she's outside in some kind of makeshift clinic. She just gets on with it and does what she wants and has to do in order to save lives. And of course, if you're motivated by the ultimate goal of saving lives, you're going to do that with the best equipment or without it. It's a war. You have to be realistic about what you can have in terms of equipment and medicine, I suppose. She is also commenting on the fact that men are crying. And I suppose here there's a degree of gender stereotyping. This was obviously 200 years ago, so our views about what men and women are or were different then. To some extent, though, this is still the same now. Rough-bearded men and being male, not supposed to cry. These, though, are men who are crying like softest-hearted women. So she has a lot of sympathy for them. She is really trying to help them. And she perhaps feels quite sympathetic to them. So those are two paragraphs that you could refer to in this extract. There could be others as well. I haven't given you an example paragraph for this because I would essentially just be retyping this in full sentences. But you need to make sure that you've got your quotes, your techniques, your words to label their attitudes, as well as commenting on why they might have the attitudes that they have and what that is saying about them or the situation. So essentially, you're just putting these details in the table into full sentences. So that's question 4. It takes a bit of practice, that one, but I'm sure by the time you get to the exam, you'll be raring to go. And finally, question 5, the writing question, the big 40 marker. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this might be a question you do first. You don't have to, But a lot of students are anxious about timing. They want to make sure that they get this question done. And if you are trying to get a grade 4, um, it might be that you do that first. You do this first, because it's very difficult to get your grade 4 without doing this question. So you don't want to run out of time. So the task for this question, and apologies that it's quite small, often worded as a quotation, choosing a future career should be based on helping others and making a positive contribution to society, not achieving status or making lots of money. So that's an opinion, hence why the paper is called Viewpoints and Opinions. Question 4, you're analysing other people's opinions, as in your two writers. Now you're in the spotlight, you're giving your opinions. So the instruction here was students had to write an article in which they had to argue their point of view. Articles, headlines, subheadings, some layout features perhaps. But as is always the case, the most important thing is to actually have some substance in your answer, to have some credibility, and to plan beforehand, not to start writing straight away, but to plan your answers first. So around the outside, I have got some 4 ideas. Each of these ideas could be developed into a paragraph. I have already done lots of videos on my channel for this question to do with deforest and developing credibility, ethos, pathos, and logos. So have a look in the, I think it's called the non-fiction writing playlist, which have a lot of resources on this question. But for this particular question, you can see that you could talk about the pitfalls of money and fame and how being rich doesn't always mean happiness. You could make up examples of that or think of some yourself. Sometimes money isn't enough. You get no satisfaction from having a lot of money. You could be quite bored. You could think about the kinds of jobs and careers that are possible for people that are dedicated to the service of others. You could also talk about the ways that young people can find the career of their dreams, whether that's academic things, apprenticeships, vocational or technical qualifications, in order to help people improve their later lives and their prospects, as well as give back to society and the public. And finally, another example that came into my head was you could talk about yourself. A lot of students don't want to do that because they get a bit, they don't like to write about themselves maybe. But remember, you can make it up. They don't know you, the examiner. These papers are marked anonymously, so you can make it up. So you could give a detailed example of something that you have done, which was not about money, but about charity, which is known as philanthropy. You might be doing some voluntary work. You might be doing something with children, like helping them to read in a school or helping your parents out somewhere. So actually, a lot of satisfaction can be obtained from voluntary work and doing charitable things, which of course are not about the money at all. If you can't think of any ideas, or if you haven't done anything like that, then make it up. And what you'd be aiming to do with this writing task is to try and sound credible. Um, in other words, when you're asked to give your opinion, you have to try and develop your ideas, because that is how people come across as knowledgeable and credible. The shorter your answer, the less developed your ideas, the less credible you will be. So you've really got to try and think of a way to develop them. So in the past, and I think I've got videos about this on my channel, I have used something which is known as the development grid, which is designed to keep students going with a point, perhaps using some deforest techniques in order to try and develop their ideas. So have a look through my videos from previous years to help with that. Being a writing question, you're going to be marked on spelling, punctuation and grammar, including paragraphing. So it's also worth bearing that in mind too. So that is a tour through paper 2 for AQA English Language. We have discussed each of the questions, as you can see on the screen. Hopefully that was useful. We're quite lucky in English because there is always a degree of predictability. We know what the questions will be asking really before we get them. We just don't know what the extracts will be. So it's really important that you as a student um, know what question is assessing what, and what skills you need to demonstrate, and what you need to write answers like in order to satisfy the mark schemes and the grading criteria. So thank you for watching. Hopefully that was useful, and good luck in your studies. Thank you.